another daughter on the way in about 3 weeks. Pretty excited about that. Dan has a almost 4-year-old.
Almost 4-year-old. Yeah.
So basically what we did is we sat our kids together on a couch. We tried very hard to get them to sit still, and they had to say 2 things: our names, followed by "my dad is awesome." Anyway, we're going to get rolling. We are really glad to be able to talk through this. Conflict is something that is never fun, but something that we find ourselves quite often in, whether we're in life or in leadership. Conflict is a common thread that runs through all of our lives at a number of different times. In no way are we claiming to be experts, but we have had a lot of experience in it, and we have worked really hard to navigate it well. So one of the things that's really unique about our relationship, Dan and I have been working together for 9 years now. If you guys want to jump to the next slide there. We've been working together for about 9 years. 9 years ago, we started dreaming about planting a new church in Wilkes-Barre. We moved there in 2012 to start Restored Church. Dan was the lead church planter. He was in the driver's seat leading our team for those first few years. And in 2017, we did a figurative and literal passing of the baton, where we were teaming up, working together. At the beginning, Dan was in the driver's seat. He passed the baton to me. I became the lead pastor at Restored in January 2017. And I think what's been really unique about that is there are not many leaders that can transition well, that can execute a succession plan well. Dan did that very well in our context at Restored. But not only did he transition, he stuck around. So he's been in 2 different roles as team leader and team member. We like to say that Dan's on loan to us at Restored as an ABWE missionary. But we've had that transition of roles where Dan was in the driver's seat, now I am. We've been able to navigate that, not just in a way where we've remained effective teammates, but we've remained best friends. So the relational foundation that we've had, and that has come where we have been very proactive in communication. We've honestly now navigated a lot of conflict between ourselves and also in our church, and God's taught us a lot in the journey over the last 7 years and leading at Restored together.
Well, I was going to say, we are best friends 364 days out of the year because he cheers for a team that is awful, okay? The Michigan Wolverines. Go blue. Boo, yeah. Right? And I grew up in Ohio, so I am a Buckeye, and and so we are best friends 364 days out of the year.
There you go.
But conflict is something that we have learned a little bit about. We're by no means experts, but we just want to share a little bit about what we've learned and continue to learn, and one of the biggest things is OIC. Now, this doesn't come from us. It comes from a professor that we had at Clark Summit University. His name is Dr. Dennis Wilhite, and Dr. Wilhite came up with this, and it's super, super helpful. Here's what it is. Observation, here's what I've observed. Here's what I see. Interpretation, here's what I am thinking based on what I have seen. C is clarification. Am I off on this? Am I right? Can you clarify this for me? So let me give you an example from my own life. I have lots of examples of how I did not follow this. I'll give you an example from marriage. This is a picture of me and my beautiful wife, Joy, but this was long before we got married. We were engaged in this picture, and you can see that she's kind of having a superiority complex because she went to Liberty University. Every other Christian I meet, I went to Liberty University. I don't understand what's going on with that. But so Joy and I got married, but as we got married and we entered into marriage in the early stages, we didn't know just how much conflict we were going to enter into. And then our son, Landon, was diagnosed with a rare heart defect. He has HLHS. He's gone through 2 open heart surgeries. And in between those surgeries, I was doing a midnight feeding one time. And I had kind of hit rock bottom. Like I was just at the end of my rope, couldn't finish the feeding. I went into the bedroom around midnight, and I was just honest with Joy, and I said, baby, I cannot finish this feeding. I'm toast, right? And I have permission to share this story. This is what she did. She sat up in bed, and she sighed like this. Just like that. Now, in my head, as a husband, I'm thinking, I know what that sigh means. It means, what kind of a man are you? What kind of a husband are you? You can't finish the feeding. What's wrong with you? And so when she went downstairs, I actually went down and I was really upset because I knew exactly what that sigh meant. And so I told her that. And I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but that next morning, Joy was not sleeping next to me in that bed. She slept in the guest room. First time that had ever happened in our marriage. Now, thankfully, there was a pastor's breakfast the very next morning. I went and told them that story, and they just laughed at me. They said, bro, that is nothing. You ain't seen nothing yet. They said, just go get a blueberry muffin, which I did, and it worked amazing. So, just a little marriage advice. Huh?
Better than flowers.
Better than flowers, yes. And as we're sitting on the couch processing this, I said, baby, why were you so mad at me? Like, I was just trying to be honest and transparent. And she goes, I wasn't mad at you. I was mad at Landon, that he wouldn't calm down for you. I wasn't mad at you at all. And so in that moment, I thought about OIC and how I totally missed it. What I should have done is in that moment when she sighed, I should have said, oh, dearest wife of mine, I have thus observed that thou hast shrugged thy shoulders and sighed vehemently. No, I'm just kidding. I should have said, hey, baby, I noticed that you're sighing. It makes me feel like you're mad at me. Like, what's up? So you don't have to use these exact words, but these are the steps. And anytime I have used this, guys, it's not just in marriage. It's in interpersonal relationships in church, at work, in your friendships. OIC. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what it makes me think. Am I right? Can you clarify for me? Super, super helpful.
So along the way, one of the things that's been really helpful is reading and studying, learning how to navigate conflict well. And a lot of it's trial and error, but there are also some really good resources out there that have been really influential in my life as I've worked through that. So one of the things I love to do is I love to read. And a few months ago, I read a book called Difficult Conversations. It was a really awesome book, not a spiritual book. It was a secular book written by 3 Harvard scholars that got together and talked about how to navigate the natural occurrence of conflict in our everyday realities, how to discuss what matters most. So they work through this on a number of different levels, whether it's in the home, with your family, with your wife, with your kids, whether it's in your workplace with your boss or a coworker, whether it's in a church and other people that you're connected with. All of us have conflict. That's a very natural and normal rhythm in our lives. So there were a number of principles in here that I thought were really, really helpful. I thought I'd share some of those with you as we think through this whole idea of conflict. The first one was to ask, not assume. And often, many of our conflicts are born out of assumptions that we never slow down long enough to actually ask about. So when you ask, rather than assuming, you're not walking in with your mind made up. You're not walking in assuming that that person has it out for you. You're not walking in assuming that you have all the facts. Rather, you're walking in and trying to investigate, hey, is my assumption true? Is it accurate? Is it honest? And you are simply entering and trying to dialogue rather than to accuse based on those assumptions that you have. Second thing they said is when you find yourself in conflict, oftentimes we think about me versus them. We think about our perspective. We don't think about their perspective. And they said what you need to do is you need to zoom out. And when you zoom out from a conflict, you don't think about your perspective only. You don't think only about their perspective. Think about this conflict if you were an objective, uninvolved third person walking into this scenario. What would you observe about yourself? What would you observe about the other person in this scenario? If you were completely uninvolved and removed from the emotions of the situation, what would a third-party perspective think about? What would they ask? What would they assume in walking into this situation? One of the biggest things they touched on was how conflict also exposes our identity issues. See, the hard thing about conflict is conflict comes up oftentimes when someone is pointing out a way that we have failed. So when you fail, there is conflict that is normally born from that. And when you then enter into a conflict with somebody else, especially if they're addressing your failures, it's really important that you don't internalize that as a part of your identity. So failure does not identify you as a failure. Just because you have failed doesn't mean that you are a failure. But when you approach it in a very self-deprecating way, assuming that because you failed, you are a failure, you typically tend to take things extremely personally. Way more personal than you should. Way more personal than that person meant it. So don't take it personally when people approach you. And when you approach other people, don't attack them personally. Attack the issue, not the person. Oftentimes when we enter into conflict, our emotions are very high. And there's one podcast I listen to that often says, when emotions are high, wisdom is low. But wisdom takes a step back. Wisdom slows down. Wisdom says, I'm going to attack the issue, not the person. The last thing I thought was really fascinating from this is they talked about giving and receiving feedback and the vital nature that plays in our lives. You know, oftentimes we struggle to give feedback because we are concerned about what the reaction is going to be from the other person when we give feedback to them. But in the same way, we are often resistant or hesitant to invite feedback into our lives because we're not sure if we're going to like what we're going to hear. So it's much easier to disconnect and disengage from giving and receiving feedback to not run the risk of other people reacting to us or us reacting to them. I love what a mentor of mine told me. He said this, that there's one major difference between amateurs and professionals, and it's not what you think. It's not the money that they make. A major difference between amateurs and professionals is that amateurs resist feedback. Professionals pay for it. Because professionals value input and they value feedback so much. They understand that feedback is key to making them who they are, that they're actually willing to invest their money in it to invite feedback into them so that they can become better people, better husbands, better leaders, and better individuals in all that they have the opportunity to engage in.
If you want a verse to go with that, because that's always helpful, Proverbs 12:1. He who hates correction is stupid. It's straight out of the Bible, people. He who hates correction is stupid. Super helpful stuff. So another book that's really been helpful is The Peacemaker. And if you haven't read The Peacemaker by Ken Sande, I would highly, highly recommend that you go through it. All of your membership at your church should go through this. And they talk about the slippery slope. And so some of us in this room tend to lean or gravitate toward escape responses. The most extreme would be suicide, but others might be flight or denial. Others of us, when conflict comes, we go, yes, I can't wait to jump in there. And we have these attack responses. It may not end up in murder, litigation, or assault, but we tend to attack rather than fly away. Now, in the middle, they have overlooking, reconciliation, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and accountability. And the book walks you through how to engage in peacemaking responses. But we want to talk about the natural pull that we have. Some of us have a natural pull toward escape responses. And I want to give you a little bit of a picture of this from a movie called Despicable Me. How many of you have seen the movie Despicable Me? Okay, so let me describe this video clip to you. It's the point in the movie where the little girl, I'm forgetting her name now, but she wants a little unicorn toy, okay? And Gru, as only Gru could do, says, no, I'm not going to get you the unicorn toy. And she goes, and he says the classic line, stop, that's freaking me out. Something like that. Stop, that's freaking me out. My accent wasn't very good. Okay, so I'm not going to try to impersonate Gru. That's not going to work out. But in that clip, what's so crazy about that clip is when kids do that, right? Just hold my breath and hope it all goes away. We kind of give them a pass because they're kids, right? But when we as adults do that, as people who are supposed to be more mature, that's something that's really unhealthy. And you know what? That's in our church. It's in our homes. And guess what? May even be inside of some of us. Now, another way of avoiding conflict can be lying. Here's a Dilbert comic. How many of you love Dilbert comics? Any Dilbert comic fans out there? All right. I've been telling employees that our culture is our best asset. Do they pretend that makes sense? Yes, because we have a culture of lying to avoid conflict. And again, that's really funny in a Dilbert comic, but isn't that true in our workplaces? In our churches at times, maybe even in our homes? These are some of the responses that are really unhealthy. Now, a biblical example of escape response would be Saul. Before Saul was crowned king, where was he? hiding among the baggage. He was escaping because he knew that with leadership comes potential conflict, and he was running from that conflict. Guys, if you're here and someone brought you today because they see potential in you, one thing you need to know about leadership is that conflict will always be there. It's not a question of if it's going to happen, it's when, and are you prepared to deal with it effectively and in a Christ-like way. Now, the strength for those of us who naturally gravitate toward an escape response is overlooking. Proverbs 19:11 says, "It is to one's glory to overlook an offense." If you gravitate to this, the strength in that is overlooking, but the weakness is neglect. In Galatians 6:1-2, the Apostle Paul commands us to step into the lives of other brothers and sisters who are wandering away from where God wants them. And when we run away from conflict, we are neglecting our brothers and sisters in Christ. We need to come alongside them, not accuse them, not attack them, but come alongside them and deal with conflict in a healthy way. Now, on the other side, some of us may not lean toward escape responses. We might lean toward attack responses. So the biblical example of this would be the Apostle Paul. You might identify with Paul, and in Galatians 2:11-14, we see Paul going directly to Peter because when the Jewish people were around, Peter was acting a certain way, but when the non-Jewish people were around, he was acting a different way. And so Paul confronted him to his face in public, but he was doing it because what he was doing wasn't in line with the gospel. Paul would be a biblical example of this. Now, the strength in this pull, if this is you, the strength is taking a stand for truth. Proverbs 27:6 says, "Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses." Guys, listen, this is such a true statement. It's so helpful. True love is tough love. True love is tough love. If all of your friends just tell you what you want to hear, they're probably not your real friends. Real friends are going to do what's necessary to help you bring you back to the heart of God, and we run far from that a lot of the time. I love what Craig Rochelle says here. He says, "Everything that is said must be true, but not everything that is true must be said." How we say what we say is just as important as what we say. And not just the how, but what we choose to say. And a lot of times, we tend to focus on things that really aren't part of the issue, but we just want to get things off our chest. And for those of us who might gravitate to an attack response, if you're in that mode, coming into a conflict situation, and you have that attitude of, I just got to get stuff off my chest, that's the wrong attitude. We've got to come into that conversation saying, I want what's best for the other person. Again, with Kyle's session, right? You are more important than me. And a lot of the time, that means we have to enter with that mindset that I'm not going to get everything off my chest in this particular situation. Now, the weakness of this pull is pride. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22, Paul says, "Flee youthful lusts." You know, I always thought that he was talking about running from sexual temptation, sexual immorality. He's actually not talking about that. What he's talking about is this idolatry of being right. And if you look at verses 23-24, he basically says, look, you are not here on this earth to prove others wrong and to be right. And a lot of us, especially those who lean toward the attack response, we are so enamored with trying to be right all of the time and prove others wrong. And where is that rooted? What does that come from? That comes from pride and arrogance and selfishness. But ultimately, our example is Jesus. Jesus is the perfect example. And in John 1:14, he was full of both grace and truth. That's what we're aiming for, because some of us in the room, we gravitate toward the response of running far from conflict, and so grace may come easier for us. Some of us, with attack responses, truth may come easier, but here's a great quote I just heard recently. Truth without grace is mean, but grace without truth is meaningless. Think about that. Truth without grace is mean, but grace without truth is meaningless. We need to balance this like Jesus, and that's why becoming more and more like Jesus is so important when it comes to conflict.
Yeah, I think so much of it comes down to what's the measure of maturity. And some of us get caught up in conflict because in our quest for maturity, we're very information driven. The measure of maturity is not information, it's transformation. The measure of maturity in our walk with Jesus is how much we are becoming like Jesus. So what we have to look at when we see the example of Jesus, who was full of both grace and truth, is how much does that define me? How much, as a person, am I becoming more like Christ in being full of both grace and truth? Not truth absent from grace, not grace absent from truth, but both. And I think for some of us in the church world, some of this is framed up by an improper expectation. We've all heard stories, or maybe we've had experiences with churches that have split, or conflict in churches that have gone really bad. Around Restored, one of the things we say, hey, there are a list of assumptions that proactively frame how we view things. So one of the assumptions we make is actually about conflict. We tell every person that enters into our church and is going through our membership process, one of the first assumptions that we lead with is that conflict is a natural and normal part of community and teamwork. So we will approach conflict as an opportunity to learn rather than an obstacle to avoid. Because what happens for many of us, when we assume that conflict isn't going to happen, well, conflict comes, and then we find ourselves really surprised, we find ourselves put on our back foot, we find ourselves really discouraged and disappointed in our church or in the people of it, and we say, hey, I didn't expect this. I don't think that this should happen in church. And if we don't expect conflict, we're going to run away and say, hey, I'm done. I'm out. But instead, when we assume that conflict is a natural and normal part of community and teamwork, we're going to approach it as an opportunity to learn rather than an obstacle to avoid. That's really, really key, because so much of conflict happens and we don't expect it, and then we find ourselves like completely surprised and confused and disillusioned. But when we assume that it's going to happen, we prepare for it. And when we're prepared, we're less shocked. When we're prepared, we're ready to handle it, because we've made pre-decisions before we are in the heat of the moment about what we will and will not do. That's key for us to understand. A lot of times conflicts even come up between churches.
No.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, it's a sad reality. Jesus prayed in John 17. His prayer was what? That we would all be one. But we've drifted very far from that, and we are no longer one, and we are now splintered into many. One of the things that we tell people at Restored is other gospel-centered churches are not competition, they're teammates.
That's right.
And I remember we had a key opportunity to apply this right when we arrived in Wilkes-Barre to start church. I hope that when you think about other churches in your region, you have friends and pastors in other churches in the area. Because if they are gospel-centered, they are not the enemy, they are not competition, they are teammates in advancing the kingdom of God in your region. So I remember when we started Restored, a few months after we got there, Parker Hill Church came to the area. And there were people that would come up to me and they go, hey, did you know that Parker Hill is starting a campus here? They were trying to drum up a reaction. They were hoping that I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm so upset, I'm so frustrated, I'm not happy about that. And I said, yeah, you know what, actually we did know that they were coming. And we're actually excited because our area needs more gospel-centered teammates to reach more people with the gospel in our area.
That's right.
And we do church very differently, but that doesn't divide us. Because in the midst of our diversity, we can still find unity in Christ. So, we were excited that Parker Hill was coming to the area. We were so excited that as pastors, we got together and prayed together for the gospel to go forward in our city. Because so often we draw unnecessary battle lines between churches and we divide when Jesus has called us to unite. So one of the things that was really cool is Parker Hill did a series on conflict. And I saw this graphic on their Facebook page, and they had 8 really good practical tips for resolving conflict. Let me walk through those with you. First, plan your words. Do not walk into a conflict in the heat of the moment and just wing it. Conflict really demands preparation, so plan your words. Think about what you're going to say and why it's important that you say that. Second, talk in person. Technology does a lot of great things for us and provides a lot of great resources. Technology is not the venue in which to resolve conflict. Don't Facebook message, don't text, don't send that angry Instagram direct message. Talk in person. There are times as a pastor, it might surprise you, but sometimes we're criticized as pastors. I'm sure if you're a pastor here, you never get any of that. But sometimes you get those angry emails. And what's your gut response? Well, I'm going to respond. I'm going to confront this person since they first confronted me. No. When I get an angry email, I don't respond to it. Instead, what I do is I pick up the phone and I say, hey, when can we sit down and talk this out? Because I want to understand what's informing this frustration. I want to understand where this came from. I want to work to understand more of where you're coming from and actually be able to dialogue about it. Talk in person. And when you choose to talk in person, choose the time and place carefully. Location and environment is very important. So think about what's going on in their life. And if they're just getting off a double shift at work, it's probably not the best opportunity to engage them when they're exhausted. If they're having a lot of issues in their family, maybe you need to choose to be patient, and maybe you need to choose to wait so that you can have the right opportunity in the right time at the right place. 4, remember there may be some facts that you're missing. You have to be humble in the way that you approach conflict. Don't assume that you have it all figured out. Actually assume the opposite. Assume that there probably are some facts that you're missing and walk into that conversation trying to dialogue and discover what's going on beneath the surface that you might not naturally and quickly see. 5, agree where you can. You are not trying to stay separated on all issues. Find your common points of agreement and build off of those. 6, don't lecture, dialogue. Make it a conversation. Don't talk at them, talk with them. 7, remember the goal. And like Dan said earlier, the goal is not to be right. The goal is resolution. So walk into it with the goal of, I want to do whatever I can to humbly dialogue with this person in order to accomplish the resolution that we both need in this. 8, give them time. Some conflict doesn't go away quickly. Sometimes it takes some time for people to process through and to be able to really decompress from it. And if they need time, be willing to give them time.
So let's talk about a final few things here quickly. When it comes to our attitude going into difficult conversations, regardless of where you naturally gravitate to on that slippery slope, we need to come into a conflict situation and especially a discussion with the attitude of discovery. And that takes asking good questions. I don't know a lot. I'm only 30 years old. But one of the things I am learning is that one of the most important skills in ministry leadership is asking good questions. Learning to ask good questions. And a couple years ago, I did some training that I basically learned I didn't ask good questions. Most of my questions were closed-ended questions, meaning they could only be answered yes or no. But then I discovered, you know what? If you ask questions with these 3 words, what, how, and why, and you can start front-loading your questions with these words, it makes them open-ended and it allows for much more dialogue. And I've started to grow in that and start to do that more frequently. I'll tell you, it has helped immensely to come in those discussions with an attitude of discovery. Stay away from you statements. As you dialogue and process, use I statements. I feel this way. I'm struggling with this. When you use you statements, it comes across as accusing, and generally the conflict can become even more conflict, and the actual issue that was at hand to begin with kind of gets tossed to the side, and the conflict just gets worse and worse. And then finally, involve the involved. A lot of us, we tend to go to one side or the other. Either we involve too many people who aren't really involved in helping bring resolution, or we don't involve enough people, maybe because we only want the people who side with us, or we only want people at the table who are going to agree with us because we just want to be right rather than get actual resolution. So involve the involved when you go in these conversations.
Yeah, you might have heard the phrase, time heals all things. That's not automatically true when it comes to conflict, especially conflict left unaddressed and unresolved. So one of the principles that we've learned a lot is that eventually what started out as a crack will become a canyon left undealt with. Cracks become canyons. If you let little things fester where bitterness, resentment, and division continue to drive a wedge between you, those things that started out as little cracks are eventually going to become canyons. One of the ways that conflict comes up in a leadership context is when you come to the issue of accountability. And accountability oftentimes, and sadly, gets a very bad rap. And that's really sad because we need accountability in our lives as leaders. And as leaders, we need to provide accountability for the people that we're leading. A few different leadership guys that we've learned from. One of those is Patrick Lencioni. He says this: failing to hold someone accountable is ultimately an act of selfishness. And so for some of us, we're people pleasers. We're scared of how people are going to react. We're scared of being misunderstood, mischaracterized, or disliked. So we would rather just let something go rather than run the risk of conflict. And really what that does is it really ends up becoming an act of selfishness where all we're doing is focusing on ourselves. Craig Groeschel talks about this, and he says, oftentimes in leadership, when you find a problem, if you as the leader fail to address that problem is no longer the problem. You have become the problem because as a leader, you have failed to address the problem. It's the same thing with accountability. We have to be willing to hold people accountable, and we have to be willing to let people hold us accountable as well. Lance Witt says this. He says, your accountability with people should make them better, not bitter. So don't approach accountability as a judgmental, nitpicky, condemning person. Don't be needlessly harsh. Approach this trying to make that person better. Make it about them, not about you. Don't make it about your frustrations. Make it about their development. And do whatever you can to hold them accountable and help them to be better as leaders. Lastly, the principle of calling up versus calling out. Accountability is not, in its purest and truest form, about calling people out. You're not just exposing people to a problem, you're calling them up to a solution. So you're going to someone and you say, I care enough about you that I'm calling you up to be all that God has called you to be. I'm calling you up to stop settling for less and be the leader that I know that you are capable of being. I'm calling you up to stop settling for mediocrity and to strive for excellence. That's something that's really important as we approach accountability. Make it about bettering the people around you so that you can be the best teammate, not only for their direction, but also for their development.
And this happens by entering those discussions with a mirror rather than a magnifying glass. If we're honest, we have become experts in identifying the minutia issues in other people's lives rather than reflecting back and going, how can I work on what I need to work on to bring resolution to this situation? So enter these conflicts with a mirror rather than a magnifying glass. It's going to be super helpful. Couple resources for you. The Peacemaker by Ken Sande and Resolving Everyday Conflict. They are available out here in the dining hall. Arrowhead has them there for you if you want to purchase them. I highly recommend that. And then 2 other books, Difficult Conversations and then Crucial Conversations is actually a class that our mission agency, ABWE, offers. And I got to go through that. Super, super helpful stuff. But here's what you're going to talk over in your Talk It Over times very briefly, or coming up briefly. Discussion question number 1. Which response to conflict do you naturally gravitate to? Is it fight or flight? Second, how have you seen conflict resolved effectively? What was the key to that resolution? Third, what causes the most conflict in your church or team? Now, I got to be honest with you. This may not be a fun question to ask around your circle, but I can tell you it will be a valuable conversation if you're willing to have it honestly and lovingly, balancing grace and truth. I tell you, this is really, really helpful. How can you do a better job at creating a culture of peace? Number 4, how does the gospel impact day-to-day conflict resolution? And number 5, spend some time praying together. We want to spend some time praying together as teams that God would make each of us more effective peacemakers in our spheres of influence.